with this balanced trade-off idea, when the driver's driving around, there's two options. Do I want the car to turn harder, or do I want the car to drive better out of the corner? And the idea is that you can't really have more of one without giving away some of the other. So then in your mind, you have to decide, okay, where is the balance that's going to make the car the best for me?
Welcome to the Your Data Driven podcast. If you like this podcast, be sure to visit our website at yourdatadriven.com for more useful help and advice on setting up your race car, mastering data analysis, and driving faster. Welcome to episode 36. Today, all the way virtually from Australia, I'm delighted to welcome Dale Thompson to the show. Dale has long worked in motorsports, and with historic cars in particular, he shares with us many interesting and pragmatic ways to better understand and set up your car so that it's easier and faster to drive on track. It was great chatting to Dale to get his insights, and I'm sure that this show will get you thinking. So, as always, grab a pen, grab a coffee, sit back, and let's enjoy what Dale has to say. You may know that at the end of season 1, I wrote the Motorsports Playbook, a summary distilling the first 20 shows into nuggets of wisdom. I made the notes so that you don't have to. If you've not got it yet, go and grab yourself a copy from the website. So welcome, Dale.
Thank you, Samir.
It's really exciting to have you here. Thank you for staying up on the other side of the world in Australia to talk to us today about racing and your experience. I know this is going to be really fascinating because of the conversations we've had prior to this chat. You're super fascinated about the suspension side of things and driver understanding of the car. And I think this is going to be really fascinating for people listening. So what would be great is if you could give us a bit of background on you so that we can have some knowledge and understanding of what you've been up to and the kind of experience you've had in the world of motorsport and high performance driving. And then maybe work towards like sort of one or two takeaways that people can go away and think, actually, yeah, you know, I'm going to try that. I'm going to give that a go. That's something I hadn't really thought of before. Or I've been struggling with that problem and I haven't really worked out how to do it. And yeah, that's an interesting suggestion. I'll give that a go. So that's the challenge. How does that sound?
That sounds great. Yes, most certainly. And so in the early 70s, my best mate, Neville Smith, and I, we were building race cars in our backyards after work sort of thing. And so very, very much and always have been sort of grassroots racing. The first Formula Ford we ran in 1973, but that was interesting mainly because there was a tyre change right at the time when I got in with the car. And what they did was they went to quite a grippy slick. And in those days, the chassis were very weak. So what happened was that the brazing joints and all this sort of thing with the slicks started to crack up and so forth. So I had a pretty bad couple of seasons with a car that sort of we really didn't know why it couldn't get on the pace. And then they changed to a radial tyre the next year and the car's turned into a jet again. So by that stage, I'd sold the car.
Okay. Were you driving the car as well, or were you just spannering, or both, or what?
I was driving the car and owner of the car. Neville and I spanned together on that car. So it was really something that we didn't understand at the time. And it was only much later that we got the idea on that one.
Yeah, it's a kind of thing, isn't it? It's just, when you start off, it's like, how hard can it be? I mean, you know, there's so many cars around, it can't be that difficult. And I think that spirit is wonderful, that it gets people in. Then they open the Pandora's box a little bit and go like, oh, this is a bit more complicated, but I'm up for the challenge. And it sounds like that's what you guys experienced.
Yes, that's right. And then in our business, we had an automotive business in the 80s. We bid by another Formula Ford, a PRS 82F. So that was a brand new car at the time. In Australia and in America as well, nobody had any success with these cars. We struggled, certainly, that had a very, very poor front motion ratio. The front was always too soft and the anti-roll bars in the front were always too soft, so the front's rolling around and there was a regular type of suspension at the rear And so it didn't work at all.
So for the benefit of the people who may not know what a motion ratio is, what's your description of a motion ratio?
Well, the travel of the spring compared to the travel of the wheel. So, for instance, if we've got a 0.5 motion ratio in my terms, that's you could turn it around the other way and say it's 2-to-1. But that means that if the spring travels 1 inch, then the wheel only travels half an inch. So it's a very important number because it tells you what your wheel stiffness is going to be, what your stiffness is going to be at the wheel.
It's one of those things that's sort of, when you're familiar with the terms of suspension and stuff like that, what's lovely about terms like a motion ratio or, I don't know, ride frequency or something like that. These kind of terms enable us to have a shorthand in explaining the concepts. But for people who are new to it, it's kind of like they're just talking jargon. I don't understand it. So it's always it's always interesting to hear how people try and understand some of these terms that we sort of throw around in motorsport. Yeah, so go on. So you've got this Formula Ford, and you're about to take the world by storm, I hope.
Well, unfortunately not, because of the design issues with that car. And in actual fact, it killed the PRS brand. They had some successful cars before, but this was their very last effort. And in fact, the Italian designer did come out to Australia, and there were 2 other cars. And I didn't have my car going at the time, but I can remember standing beside him at the pit counter, watching the 2 cars going around. The other 2 drivers were really good. They were better than me, but they weren't competitive. Unfortunately for us, the designer had no real idea for us. So he went home and all the cars failed. We did have a lot of learning things that we sort of came to later. And one of them was spring frequency. You mentioned before that we've got this sort of bounce test, and you can see it on our website. And it's a way of being able to work out the suspension stiffness when you can't actually measure the motion ratio.
So tell us about the bounce test. How does that work? Because I've been in the paddock with people who they just bounce other people's cars, and I don't really know what they think they're looking for or whatever. They're just trying to compare the stiffness, I suppose. But so tell us about your bounce test, because I think it's really simple, isn't it? And I think people could go, yeah, actually, I'll give that a go.
Yes. If you push the car with the shocks in, then it's going to feel very, very different to if you remove the shocks and the springs are still in place. And that could be with a live rear axle, it could have springs on a lower control arm, same at the front, springs on a lower control arm. And you can find that you can bounce the car very freely. So if you keep pushing the car down without sort of trying to control it. So the idea is that you let it bounce up to you, then you push down quite sharply just to keep the bouncing motion going. And then you start to count. So I count how many bounces per 30 seconds. So, for instance, if you bounce it up and down and you count it to 60, if you multiply by 2, that would be 120 cycles per minute. So you're getting to actually what the spring frequency is without having to calculate anything. And also the spring itself is bending in the situation in the car. Whereas if you measure the spring rate out of the car, you're pushing straight. So on a racing spring with heavy wire, the heavy wire bending actually adds about 20 or 30% to the stiffness of the spring. So normally you wouldn't know that. But with a bounce test, you can find out exactly what the suspension frequency is.
Oh, okay. That's fascinating. We've gone off on a tangent already, which is totally fine. We will go back to your racing history. I think we're mid-70s at the moment. Why do you care about the frequency of the suspension?
Yeah, well, this is interesting. It's actually been the most important modification to the car to get the spring frequency right. And we're talking in our business, non-aero cars. These are all owner drivers that we're working for or the ones that are taking our training. So what's most likely is that the springs in the car already would be a sporty spring that they might have bought from a catalogue or something like that. And so therefore, it's like the spring frequency will be around about 110 or 115 cycles maybe even not 115 if the car's got a pretty poor motion ratio. And of course, strut cars, they'll tend to be a bit stiffer because they've got a motion ratio of roughly 1:1. So in those cases, often the spring frequencies will be up, but there's a lot of grip to be gained if you can get the spring frequencies up from around about 110. Even if you can get them in that sort of 120, 125 cycles per minute range, say with a historic car or something like that, a sports car, and you might find that's all it can take because it hasn't got enough suspension stiffness and so forth. But the increase in the performance is absolutely amazing. Even going from, say, 110 cycles per minute in a Camaro, fairly recently, we got it up to just over 120. This guy went a second and a half faster and he won his first race. And all it was just spring frequency and gaining more grip. And we had no idea this was going to happen until we actually did it.
What's it doing by increasing the frequency? I mean, listening to you speak, it sort of sounds like, okay, well, there's this kind of 120 cycles per minute number that is like a sweet spot, but is that applicable to, like, if someone's listening, is that applicable to, their car, or what is it that this is doing for them?
The sweet spot's for a modern car is more like 150 cycles per minute. And all that we know about it, because we haven't got any 7-post rigs, of course, nothing that we can do to be able to do those sort of tests to be able to find out. So it is just by the clock and some degree of experience, but the car has to be reasonably stiff in all aspects, like have proper wheel bearings and probably not the old style wheel bearings that and so forth, to be able to work around 150, because any sort of looseness in the suspension and you do lose grip. So the 150 cycles per minute, if you go stiffer again, which a lot of times you'll buy springs, especially on struts, that are actually going to take it over that. But there's probably no gain to be had and maybe a downside by going stiffer. So the only proof that we have is in the performance. And one example that everybody will know is the Miata, spec Miata in America, the car as it was before this last changes. The front springs are about 4 times stiffer than standard. So they've gone up from around about 200 to 700 pounds per inch in the front, and in an acceptable rear spring, which of course is going to be about 80% of the stiffness of the front. And that's all it is. And yet everybody knows those cars handle. It's amazing that just with suspension stiffness that you can go so much faster.
It is certainly amazing. I don't know, it's just fascinating to hear different approaches to that, because this sort of practical experience that you've had, and then there's a kind of more mathematical approach. And yours is kind of in the middle, really, because it's kind of, you're not talking about, well, you've just talked about spring stiffnesses for the first time, but what you were talking about is this frequency, and that is, once you work that out, that's relative to your car.
Yes, I'm sorry about that. I really meant suspension frequency or suspension stiffness. To me, I sort of put those together, and I do sort of mean the sort of suspension frequency when I'm talking, yeah.
Because, of course, the lovely thing about using that number rather than a spring stiffness is that it accounts for the motion ratio, and it accounts for the type of suspension that you have, and then all these kind of variables kind of come out in the wash, really, which is a nice way of doing it. I haven't got any calculations on the website. I should probably do that. I should probably write an article on like how to do these sort of basic spring calcs for frequency and stuff like that to help people out.
I think it's useful because the results are in, as soon as you've got an aero car, well, it's completely different, but for the non-aero.
And that's the other challenge, isn't it? Sort of different types of car are going to want different things. And then so therefore we've gone from this sort of trying to make things simple, and then we've immediately making it more complicated, because we've got to, well, this kind of works for this car, but if you've got a car with wings and slicks, well, we've got to start again. We've got a different thing to worry about, because then aero is more important than the tyre. And so, or we don't want the aero moving around because it's going to affect the tyre too much. It's a really fascinating subject. What I want to do, I want to get back to like your experience. So you're in the PRS Formula Ford. How have we got from that PRS Formula Ford with you guys kind of doing this as a hobby to what you do today, which is helping people out? Let's try and fill in the gap a bit.
Okay, so we did retire the PRS in 1988, and that was it for our racing. So when we formed Racing Car Technology, that was in 1998 in the late 90s. So just out of interest, I was reading Circle Track magazine for one, which was very, very good on suspension stuff, and Race Car Engineering magazine. And then around about that time as well, Mark Ortiz wrote 4 articles, a series of articles in Race Car Engineering magazine. So that really got me going, that one. I thought he did a fantastic job on those. So Neville and I were thinking that we needed more work because we're in a regional town, and we'd never intended to get back into working on race cars, but we decided straight off that that's what we were going to do. We'd only be working in the owner-driver market where we thought we could have an impact straight off. The one thing we worked out was that nobody's ever going to pay us to do testing on their car. We have to be able to get a setup in the workshop that we can take to the racetrack, and then within a short space of time be able to determine whether we had a good balance or not. And the surprising thing with these suspension frequency increases and stuff that we were doing, it was just immediately successful. We were getting seconds increases in lap times for people, and people could go from the midfield to being at the front in historic racing. And the actual calculations that got me going were in competition car suspension, Alan Staniforth.
With the old string computer.
Yes, that's right. We also had the Carroll Smith cutouts as well.
Yeah, wonderful.
For a tune to win, but that was in the 80s that we're doing that.
Super practical book, that, isn't it? It's really, I know engineers listening sort of, they've got not always the most complimentary thing to say about that book, but you read it and it's just like, it's so practical, and you just think, I can actually do that. I can try that. And I kind of, it's got enough basis in, that it works. And you just think, oh, okay, yeah, I'm going to give that a go. So it's wonderful.
Yes. So the main thing was to be able to get the calculations out for the balance of the car. And so we've used David Gould's calculations. It was Chapter 8, weight transfer, a tricky balancing act. And yeah, we worked the calculations exactly as he did it. Then I went to a Claude Rowell seminar, and he was using very, very similar calculations. I think they were exactly the same up to a point. And what I never did was worry about any complicated or detailed measurement of the anti-roll bars. We were just using a simple lever arm and a stiffness calculation for the anti-roll bar. And that was what worked for us straight off, that we could actually get a car that was in a setup window in a workshop and then go to the track and go from there.
And you know what you just said there, that's a really good point, just to emphasize the word window. It was the word window, and there's a sort of diminishing returns on some of this stuff, such that the noise of the environment, if that makes sense, like so like racetracks are kind of noisy orally, but also the weather changes and all this sort of stuff, and the surface is different every time you go there. So what you're trying to do all the time is get the car to a point where it's not bad. But the window being like, there is, unlike some things in life where if you go to the extreme of one end, that's as good as it can get. With a racing car, it's kind of like in the middle. You're sitting, it's almost like driving it. You're always sort of balancing one way or the other. And you can either be like way below the optimum or way above the optimum, and both are going to be rubbish. and so what you're trying to do is aim for this sort of sweet spot in the middle, which people talk about as this kind of window. And I think it's such an important point to emphasize when people are thinking about their own car and their own settings. It's like there isn't an optimum setting. There is for one corner on one lap on one particular time of the day at a particular track. There is, but all the rest of the time, it's not going to be quite right. And so the idea is to get as close to that all the time. So what you're talking about here is being able to use a little bit of this knowledge and these calculations to do that in the workshop, so that when you hit the track, you know it's going to be there or thereabouts. And then given the level of driving that, the owner driver kind of thing, that the rest is going to come from them. So if you can give them the confidence in the car as well as more grip, then they're going to go quicker.
Yes, and particularly with historic cars, again, which are interesting, and also production cars, but probably more so with the historic cars. Many of these cars are driven for year after year after year, and a lot of the owners, after we've done a setup like we're talking about, where we've got the anti-roll bars in it that we want, we've got the springs that we want in the car, they find it's adjustable for the first time, even though they've been driving it for ages. And to have got it in that setup window and then be able to raise the rear pan hard bar and feel the change the balance of the car. It's common, of course, that with any sort of professional race car, they're going to be there because they're playing around in that area all the time. But unfortunately, owner drivers, it's a real hard thing to get there just by changing things. Doesn't work.
Yeah. Another great point you've just mentioned is about feeling the changes, because I've worked with drivers and because they're not professionals, you make a change to the car and they're unsure about if they will feel it or not. And what you've just said there is quite nice, because if the car's in a good operating window, they will feel it. and if it's not, they're not going to feel it, because there's too many other things happening that are swamping that feeling.
Yep, that's for sure.
So tell us a bit more. So you've come through and you're now like helping these owner drivers with their, is that what you do day to day kind of thing?
Yes, that's what we did then for 20 odd years, and we were learning heaps along the way as well. And it just doesn't come gradually. Usually we get some insight all at once, and then it goes on again pretty much where we're at, the same thing, and then we make some steps forward again. And we did, for instance, we got an air-operated dyno, and we started building shocks, which turned out to be good for us. We're building American shocks QA1 and making them suitable for production cars. And in most cases, because adjustable shock absorbers are not really needed in a production car environment, unless you're racing at the top level, most owner drivers can't really adjust what they've got. So we would like to, say, pick a curve and to go with that, just a single shock absorber setting.
Yeah, so shock absorbers are a whole subject that I'm laughing because I've worked for a damper manufacturer, actually. So you'd think I'd have an idea of what I was doing. And then I looked into it earlier this year because someone asked me, what's a good damper settings, and what's a good spring bar and damper setups for me. And I thought, well, that's something I should tackle, So I had a look at it, and then it was literally a case of down the rabbit hole of dampers. And I've got scared about it, to be honest. It's like, right, how do I go back up the rabbit hole and not... Because no one really wants to know all this kind of nerdy stuff that I've just discovered. And it's just one of those things. It's like, right, okay, how do I simplify it? So how have you tackled it? Because it can be more complicated than you realise, basically. Or certainly I did.
Yes, that's right. If we're working with somebody's adjustable shocks, most of the time it's checking what they've got, because over time, the adjustments just go crazy. And, of course, there's no leaking shock. There's nothing there to tell the drivers that it's wrong. So mainly what we're helping there is to be able to decide if we can get some reasonable settings. And that might be, for us, when we've got working with poor motion ratios particularly, a fair bit of nose on the shock, bringing up the force fairly quickly. And then, of course, not too much high speed, and to be able to bleed it off fairly quickly. And then we're not doing a lot with the rebound side of the curve. But again, just what would be fairly reasonable, with about 1/3 of the total shock in the bump and 2/3 on the bottom.
Yeah, that's the window, isn't it? That's where everyone aims for. So it's just like, but I think your point there on the people knowing what they've got is really important, because they do change over time. And when the shock absorber manufacturer goes, "Oh, you should service your damper every year," people sort of push back a bit and think, well, they look the same. I've not really used them that much. So, I mean, and it's difficult as someone who's, doing it and sort of selling that as, I don't sell that service, but, other people, they just feel as if there's a bit, the person giving me the advice has got a bit of a vested interest in me having my dampers serviced every year, because they're going to get paid. You just think, oh, do I really need to do it, kind of thing? But yeah, you would say yes, they would, I guess.
I think so, but we're talking in historic racing and also in production cars, really, a lot of fairly low-end shocks. So the adjustments are not working as well as they would be with high-end Penske's or Öhlins, and of course at the top end. So of course some people have those, and if I had my way in the historic categories for the production cars, then I would recommend to my customers that they have Penske's, but a lot of them don't want to go that much. And even the guy that's got lap records is running my QA1 shocks on the front of his Mustangs.
Yeah, and that's that's wonderful. So one thing that does come up is people confusing springs and shocks as what they do. So have you experienced that, and how would you help people through that? Maybe that slight confusion.
Yes. And so if people were thinking that they were going to be able to turn up the shock absorbers to make it handle, that may not be the case, because the stiffer shock will actually slow down the suspension. It'll slow down the transitions. And so that may not be the best thing. Mostly it's not. Mostly, especially at the rear, you do want to let the car roll. If you grab hold of it with the shock absorbers, it will probably go slower. So that's not going to work. And if you had a car like a Formula V or something like that, if you turn the rear shocks up too much, the car will actually start oversteering. And that's because it hasn't got any suspension left now. You're actually making it go hard with the rear shocks.
So, and I think this is a part of the confusion, because you turn them up and it gets stiffer, in inverted commas, but only during the moment when you're in that transition. But that's the bit that most drivers, well, a lot of drivers feel, isn't it? That's the bit that they're trying to get the car from the straight into the corner, and so that's the bit where they maybe want the most balance or whatever. So people say, okay, we'll make it stiffer, but it's kind of by turning the shocks up. but it's kind of not quite right to say that. But although the effect is sort of similar for that moment in time, but it's not quite the same as putting a different spring in.
It may be that slowing down the roll, though, is the thing that's happening, especially at the rear. It's hard to put shocks that are too stiff on the front, maybe, but at the rear, it can really cruel things. There's one set of shocks that were on a Mazda MX-5 that we did a lot of work with over the years, and I always thought that the rear was okay. And when I tested them, I said, well, we've got to keep them at the soft end all the time. If we go stiffer, it's not going to be any good. But it worked out that it was actually that they were still too stiff. And when I built some shocks for it in QA1 and got the car to roll more in a particular turn one to very high speed, where the cars rolled over for quite a long time, and the old shocks have been holding the car so much that with the correct shock settings in the rear, the car was rolling over right onto the bump stops, and it was actually bouncing off the bump stops. And the old shock absorbers have been holding the car. It still felt quick and everything else, but we were able to put more suspension travel in, get the bump stops right at the rear, and then the car went really, really great. And the MX-5 guru in New South Wales, he had a drive of the car and he said it's the best MX-5 he's ever driven, or the best handling.
Well, that's a compliment. That's a compliment for sure.
Yeah. But there's, of course, a lot of other things involved in getting them to that stage.
So talking about driving and driver sensing and things like that, what's your experience and have you got any tips for people who are driving and think, okay, well, I want to develop my car, I want it to go faster, but part of that feedback is my feeling. So how can I get better at making that sort of sensing feeling? I think this is something you've done a little bit of with people. So
it's something we're doing in the vehicle dynamics training, and it's got a lot to do with what we could call the balance trade-off. So if we had a car that was that we were trying to decide on whether we wanted to have more understeer or more oversteer, if we're calling those the two comparisons, or we could be saying we want less oversteer than what we've got. But however we were going to look at that problem, that with this balance trade-off idea, when the driver's driving around, there's two options. You could say, do I want more turn? Do I want the car to turn harder? Or do I want more drive? Do I want the car to drive better out of the corner? And the idea is that you can't really have more of one without giving away some of the other. So if you were to say that you wanted more turn, well, that is, you want a more agile car, so that would be making the adjustment in the anti-roll bars, say, towards oversteer, and then the car's going to turn better. But then you have to weigh up, well, but I can't get to the throttle as easily as I was before. So then in your mind, you have to decide, well, okay, where is the balance that's going to make the car the best for me? And so if you're looking at the data and you're saying, yes, I'm now losing on the corner exit, then maybe you've gone too far with the oversteer. So it's this sort of agility versus stability type thing, but without taking it to any sort of calculations that you might do. But we're just thinking, well, agility is more oversteer and stability is more understeer. And that in testing, and if you've got your idea of where your balance of the car is in this setup window, percentage, it might be that you're starting off thinking that it's 5% in the direction of understeer. So that'll be a pretty normal calculation to do in the weight transfer worksheet to find out what that percentage is. And then it's all down to the driver to be able to get the final setting.
It's just really interesting to simplify it again, isn't it? It's simplifying that feeling that the driver's having and giving them a simple choice of, well, you can have a bit more agility on the turn in, or you can have a bit more drive on the exit. How that's achieved, don't worry about it for the moment. But what would you prefer? What would you prefer? And that focuses the driver on the driving part and trying to work out what they want the car to be doing for them, which I think is one of the biggest things with feedback, is not necessarily trying to engineer the car, but just trying to work out what you as a driver want from the car. What is it that you want? What's going to give you more confidence? What's going to give you more ability to push on? What one thing is holding you kind of back that you wish wasn't there? And if you haven't consciously thought of that before, it's quite a revelation, I think, when you do, because it's like, well, okay, well, I can drive around next time, my next session, and I can have one mind on, like, yeah, what is it that I'm trying to do on turn 3 that I can't? And then suddenly the driver's getting better at sensing and more aware, and they're also able to do better feedback. Whether it's possible to do anything about these problems is a different question, but at least they're aware and giving that feedback.
Well, yes, but with our setups, we would say, well, you've always got to have adjustable front and rear anti-roll bars. The thought there is that you can work in a range. We'd suggest that looking at where you are, where you think you are in the setup window, according to what the calculations have been saying, then we want to put understeer in from there and say, let's make sure that we can get too much understeer into this car. And sometimes when there's been problems with working out the stiffness of the anti-roll bars, we found that people have gone right through this process, not with us, but with us there, but with our consulting, and they never actually got the car to understeer. And that case was a historic Formula Ford, and neither of us recognised really what was happening with the front anti-roll bar that was taking a lot of stiffness out of it. That's really important. Of course, it's easy to feel pretty much when you get there. You say, oh, yeah, that's definitely understeering. And then to get the car balance back to where it should be with the rear anti-roll bar, because there's so much more feel at the rear and the car will be more sensitive to an adjustment at the rear that can get you there. So without aero, we say that, yes, you can. You can be in that situation where you can have the balance in this window wherever you want it.
Oh, that's fantastic. It's great to hear that. And that also that feeling of being able to, I don't know, progress through these different stages of adjustments and learnings and things like that. I know the people might think about diffs. And do you do anything with diffs and mucking around with diff ramps and stuff? I hesitate again because it's the most painful. It's a really annoying thing to change, but it can have a big impact on all of this stuff as well.
Absolutely. Yep. We found in the big touring cars though that the True Track and similar diffs, that they're probably the best way to go. Just seems to be easier than having to wrecking so many diffs and rebuilding so many diffs. The True Track's pretty bulletproof and seems to be okay.
Oh, wonderful! Right, well, I'm looking at the time. I can't believe it's gone so quickly. Have you got one or two final thoughts for us? If next time we're at the track, from your experience of the owner drivers that you worked with over the years, what's one or two things there that you think, guys, try this?
Yeah, well, absolutely. I think I really can't go past the idea of being able to decide or make a judgment as to what you would like to do with the balance of the car. And when you think about normally, as you might be making a track map and writing your notes on the corners and so forth, really, if you could make an overall judgment, make a judgment in your own mind about how much getting the extra drive is going to affect you and where, and then maybe look at the data, look at your speed trace and do your overlays and see if you can pick it from there as to what is the balance, rather than trying to look at individual corners and say, I'd like to be able to have less understeer there. Then, of course, you've got driving possibilities as well that you could, of course, adjust your driving to suit a situation where it's just a one-off. But to think overall as to whether you would want more drive, and that would be dialing in some understeer so that you can get to the throttle, or whether you'd like the car to turn in better, more agile car, and in that case, that might be tightening up the rear anti-roll bar and seeing if you can drive it with a bit more oversteer in it.
That's absolutely wonderful. So you're online. Where can people find you if they want to get in touch or send you an email or whatever? Where can people get in touch?
My email, Dale Thompson, racingcartech@gmail.com. And Racing Car Technology, the website is all one word, suspensionsetup.info.
Wonderful. I'll put some links in the description anyway so that people can find you. But look, I just want to say thank you very much for calling in from Australia. And it's great to hear your experiences, and it's such a global sport that we have. And, it's lovely to be able to do this and have these kind of conversations. So look, really appreciate you taking the time. Without doubt, Dale brings a unique passion and perspective to his approach to going racing. He let slip a couple of his secret sauce approaches there, so I hope you picked these up as we went along. I really enjoyed talking with Dale, and I hope you got a lot from this show too. If you like this episode, be sure to subscribe to the podcast and visit us at yourdatadriven.com.